Agitated Bulgarians formed insurgent bands which made raids into Macedonia, and insurrection became endemic in the province, bursting out in full force in 1902. By that date, Serb and Greek bands had joined in the confusion. The powers intervened at that point to inaugurate a program of reform in Macedonia under Austro-Russian supervision. The Congress of Berlin began the liquidation of the Turkish position in North Africa. France, which had been occupying Algeria since 1830, established a French protectorate over Tunis as well in 1881. This led to the British occupation of Egypt the following year. Not to be outdone, Italy put in a claim for Tripoli, but could get no more than an exchange of notes, known as the Mediterranean Agreement of 1887, by which England, Italy, Austria, Spain, and Germany promised to maintain the status quo in the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Aegean, and the Black Seas, unless all parties agreed to changes. The only concrete advantage to Italy in this was a British promise of support in North Africa, in return for Italian support of the British position in Egypt. This provided only tenuous satisfaction for the Italian ambitions in Tripoli, but it was reinforced in 1900 by a French-Italian agreement by which Italy gave France a free hand in Morocco in return for a free hand in Tripoli. By 1900, an entirely new factor began to intrude into the Eastern question. Under Bismarck, 1862–1890, Germany had avoided all non-European adventures. Under William II, 1888–1918, any kind of adventure, especially a remote and uncertain one, was welcomed. In the earlier period, Germany had concerned itself with the Near East question only as a member of the European Concert of Powers, and with a few incidental issues such as the use of German officers to train the Turkish army. After 1889, the situation was different. Economically, the Germans began to invade Anatolia by establishing trading agencies and banking facilities. Politically, Germany sought to strengthen Turkey's international position in every way. This effort was symbolized by the German Kaiser's two visits to the Sultan in 1889 and 1898. On the latter occasion, he solemnly promised his friendship to the Sultan Abdul Hamid and the 300 million Mohammedans who revere him as Caliph. Most important, perhaps, was the projected Berlin to Baghdad railway scheme, which completed its main trunk line from the Austro-Hungarian border to Nusaybin in northern Mesopotamia by September 1918. This project was of the greatest economic, strategic, and political importance, not only to the Ottoman Empire and the Near East, but to the whole of Europe. Economically, it tapped a region of great mineral and agricultural resources, including the world's greatest petroleum reserves. These were brought into contact with Constantinople, and beyond that with Central and Northwestern Europe. Germany, which was industrialized late, had a great unsatisfied demand for food and raw materials, and a great capacity to manufacture industrial products, which could be exported to pay for such food and raw materials. Efforts had been made, and continued to be made by Germany, to find a solution to this problem by opening trade relations with South America, the Far East, and North America. Banking facilities and a merchant marine were being established to encourage such trade relations. But the Germans, with their strong strategic sense, knew well that relations with the areas mentioned were at the mercy of the British fleet, which would almost unquestionably control the seas during wartime. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway solved these crucial problems. It put the German metallurgical industry in touch with the great metal resources of Anatolia. It put the German textile industry in touch with the supplies of wool, cotton, and hemp of the Balkans, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. In fact, it brought to almost every branch of the German industry the possibility of finding a solution for its critical market and raw material problems. Best of all, these connections, being almost entirely overland, would be within reach of the German army and beyond the reach of the British Navy. For Turkey itself, the railway was equally significant. Strategically, it made it possible for the first time for Turkey to mobilize her full power in the Balkans, the Caucasus area, the Persian Gulf, or the Levant. It greatly increased the economic prosperity of the whole country. It could be run, as it was after 1911, on Mesopotamian petroleum. It provided markets and thus incentives for increased production of agricultural and mineral products. It greatly reduced political discontent, public disorder, and banditry in the areas through which it ran. It greatly increased the revenues of the Ottoman treasury in spite of the government's engagement to pay subsidies to the railroad for each mile of track built and for a guaranteed income per mile each year. The great powers showed mild approval of the Baghdad Railway until about 1900. Then, for more than 10 years, Russia, Britain, and France showed violent disapproval and did all they could to obstruct the project. After 1910, this disapproval was largely removed by a series of agreements by which the Ottoman Empire was divided into exclusive spheres of influence. During the period of disapproval, the great powers concerned issued such a barrage of propaganda against the plan that it is necessary even today to warn against its influence. They described the Baghdad Railway as the entering wedge of German imperialist aggression seeking to weaken and destroy the Ottoman Empire and the stakes of the other powers in the area. The evidence shows quite the contrary. Germany was the only great power which wanted the Ottoman Empire to be strong and intact. Britain wanted it to be weak and intact. France generally shared the British point of view, although the French, with a $500 million of dollars investment in the area, wanted Turkey to be prosperous as well. Russia wanted it to be weak and partitioned, a view which was shared by the Italians and, to some extent, by the Austrians. The Germans were not only favorably inclined toward Turkey. Their conduct seems to have been completely fair in regard to the administration of the Baghdad Railway itself. At a time when American and other railways were practicing wholesale discrimination between customers in regard to rates and freight handling, the Germans had the same rates and the same treatment for all, including Germans and non-Germans. They worked to make the railroad efficient and profitable, although their income from it was guaranteed by the Turkish government. In consequence, the Turkish payments to the railroad steadily declined, and the government was able to share in its profits to the extent of almost 3 million francs in 1914. Moreover, the Germans did not seek to monopolize control of the railroad, offering to share equally with France and England, and eventually with other powers. France accepted this offer in 1899, but Britain continued to refuse, and placed every obstacle in the path of the project. When the Ottoman government in 1911 sought to raise their customs duties from 11 to 14% in order to finance the continued construction of the railway, Britain prevented this. In order to carry on the project, the Germans sold their railroad interests in the Balkans and gave up the Ottoman building subsidy of $275,000 a kilometer. In striking contrast to this attitude, the Russians forced the Turks to change the original route of the line from northern Anatolia to southern Anatolia by threatening to take immediate measures to collect all the areas, amounting to over 57 million francs, due to the Tsar from Turkey under the Treaty of 1878. The Russians regarded the projected railway as a strategic threat to their Armenian frontier. Ultimately, in 1900, they forced the Sultan to promise to grant no concessions to build railways in northern Anatolia or Armenia except with Russian approval. The French government, in spite of the French investments in Turkey of 2.5 billion francs, refused to allow Baghdad railway securities to be handled on the Paris Stock Exchange. To block the growth of German Catholic missionary activities in the Ottoman Empire, the French persuaded the Pope to issue an encyclical ordering all missionaries in that empire to communicate with the Vatican through the French consulates. The British opposition became intense only in April 1903. Early in that month, Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne made an agreement for joint German, French and British control of the railroad. Within 3 weeks, this agreement was repudiated by the government because of newspaper protests against it, although it would have reduced the Turks and Germans together to only 14 out of 30 votes on the board of the directors of the railway. When the Turkish government in 1910 tried to borrow abroad $30 million secured by the customs receipts of the country, it was summarily rebuffed in Paris and London, but obtained the sum without hesitation in Berlin. In view of these facts, the growth of German prestige and the decline in favor of the Western powers at the Sultan's court is not surprising, and goes far to explain the Turkish intervention on the side of the Central Powers in the War of 1914 to 1918. The Baghdad Railway played no real role in the outbreak of the war of 1914, because the Germans in the period 1910 to 1914 were able to reduce the great powers' objections to the scheme. This was done through a series of agreements which divided Turkey into spheres of foreign influence. In November 1910, a German-Russian agreement at Potsdam gave Russia a free hand in northern Persia, withdrew all Russian opposition to the Baghdad Railway, and pledged both parties to support equal trade opportunities for all, the open door policy, in their respective areas of influence in the Near East. The French were given 2,000 miles of railway concessions in western and northern Anatolia, and in Syria in 1910 to 1912, and signed a secret agreement with the Germans in February 1914, by which these regions were recognized as French spheres of influence. While the route of the Baghdad Railway was recognized as a German sphere of influence, both powers promised to work to increase the Ottoman tax receipts. The French withdrew their opposition to the railway, and the French gave the Germans the 70 million franc investment which the French already had in the Baghdad railway, in return for an equal amount in the Turkish bond issue of 1911, which France had earlier rebuffed, plus a lucrative discount on a new Ottoman bond issue of 1914. The British drove a much harder bargain with the Germans. By an agreement of June 1914, Britain withdrew her opposition to the Baghdad railway, allowed Turkey to raise her customs from 11% to 15%, and accepted a German sphere of interest along the railway route in return for promises: 1. That a railway would not be extended to the Persian Gulf but would stop at Basra on the Tigris River; 2. That British capitalists would be given a monopoly on the navigation of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and exclusive control over irrigation projects based on these rivers; 3. That 2 British subjects would be given seats on the board of directors of the Baghdad Railway; 4. That Britain would have exclusive control over the commercial activities of Kuwait, the only good port on the upper Persian Gulf; 5. That a monopoly over the oil resources of the area from Mosul to Baghdad would be given to a new corporation in which British finances would have a half interest, Royal Dutch Shell Company a quarter interest, and the Germans a quarter interest; and 6. That both powers would support the open door policy in commercial activities in Asiatic Turkey. Unfortunately, this agreement, as well as the earlier ones with the powers, became worthless with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. However, it is still important to recognize that the Entente powers forced upon the Germans a settlement dividing Turkey into spheres of interest in place of the projected German settlement based on international cooperation in the economic reconstruction of the area. These struggles of the great powers for profit and influence in the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire could not fail to have profound effects in Turkish domestic affairs. Probably the great mass of the Sultan's subjects were still untouched by these events, but an animated minority was deeply stirred. This minority received no encouragement from the despotic Abdul Hamid II, Sultan from 1876 to 1909. While eager for economic improvements, Abdul Hamid II was opposed to the spread of the Western ideas of liberalism, constitutionalism, nationalism, or democracy, and did all he could to prevent their propagation by censorship, by restrictions on foreign travel or study abroad by Turks, and by an elaborate system of arbitrary police rule and governmental espionage. As a result, the minority of liberal, nationalistic, or progressive Turks had to organize abroad. They did this at Geneva in 1891 in a group which is generally known as the Young Turks. Their chief difficulty was to reconcile the animosities which existed between the many linguistic groups among the Sultan's subjects. This was done in a series of congresses held in Paris, notably in 1902 and in 1907. At the latter meeting were representatives of the Turks, Armenians, Bulgars, Jews, Arabs, and Albanians. In the meantime, this secret organization had penetrated the Sultan's army, which was seething with discontent. The plotters were so successful that they were able to revolt in July 1908 and forced the Sultan to re-establish the constitution of 1876. At once divisions appeared among the rebel leaders, notably between those who wished a centralized state and those who accepted the subject nationalities' demands for decentralization. Moreover, the Orthodox Muslims formed a league to resist secularization, and the army soon saw that its chief demands for better pay and improved living conditions were not going to be met. Abdul Hamid took advantage of these divisions to organize a violent counter-revolution, April 1909. It was crushed, the Sultan was deposed, and the Young Turks began to impose their ideas of a dictatorial Turkish national state with ruthless severity. A wave of resistance arose from the non-Turkish groups and the Orthodox Muslims. No settlement of these disputes was achieved by the outbreak of the World War in 1914. Indeed, we shall see in a later chapter, the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 precipitated a series of international crises, of which the outbreak of war in 1914 was the latest and most disastrous.